We will be adding the fifth individual. Qualifying is Mr. Irwin, Schiff of Connecticut.
So the 5-minute opening statement, essentially the question being, why should you be President of the United States? The first person to speak will be Irwin Schiff.
Well, of course, my home is now in Las Vegas, Nevada. It used to be in the fair state of Connecticut, but of course now I'm a Westerner. While I should be president, unlike Harry Brown, I'm not concerned with explaining to the American voter why government doesn't work. I'm assumed that any American who's not brain dead knows that already. What I'm concerned is explaining to the American public why most of what the federal government does is either illegal and unconstitutional. For example, the Constitution clearly authorizes the government to borrow money, but nothing in the Constitution allows the government to lend money, which means 80% of what the government does with FHA financing, student loans, making loans through the International Monetary Fund are all unconstitutional and illegal, and the American public should know that. Also, the American public should know that the Constitution requires the federal government only to coin money and making gold and silver a token, a payment in debt. What we now have circulating as money, that the courts have allowed the irredeemable notes of a private bank impressed with the statement, this is legal tender, and the federal government was given no authority in the Constitution to make anything legal tender, and now what we have is circulating in the United States is the repudiated notes of a private bank, and it's that private bank which should be eliminated. The point is this. The American public should be made to understand that all U.S. coin and currency is counterfeit. The American public should also be made to understand that Social Security is nothing but a chain letter that is run out of chain. The American public should know that when Dole and Clinton talk about the trust funds being viable to the year 2022, there are no trust funds. Every penny ever collected by the government for Social Security has already been spent. But when the government collects $100 million in Social Security and spends $80 million in Social Security benefits, they spend the balance. And then they give themselves an IOU for the money they spend, and they say the money we're spending is really an asset because we're giving ourselves IOUs for the money we spent, and that's an asset. Of course, nobody can write themselves an IOU and claim it as an asset, neither can the federal government. Also, the American public should know that the federal government runs the world's biggest fence. IRS agents have no authority to seize property and payment of income taxes. There is no authority in the Internal Revenue Code for IRS agents to seize property. The IRS is purely an administrative agency. Unlike the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, they have no enforcement powers, but they get away with it nevertheless. As a matter of fact, I happen to have, if you the Internal Revenue Code here, which of course I sell, and there's no provision in the Internal Revenue Code for any American to pay income taxes, nor keep books and records for income tax purposes. And why are Americans paying? Because they're intimidated and coerced by the corruption and criminality of the federal judiciary, who put people in jail for violating laws that do not exist in order to intimidate the American public into paying a tax that no law requires them to pay. I, as well as millions of other Americans now, no longer pay income taxes. And as a matter of fact, Americans have a patriotic duty not to pay income taxes because we have a government that is run wild. Talk about civil seizures. Property is being seized every day by the United States government without charges being brought against anybody. You know why? Because federal judges said property doesn't have any rights. That's a brilliant statement. Whoever claimed that property had rights, only a federal judge could figure out that property has no rights. Of course, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution said that no American should have property, can be deprived of property without due process of law. And it's an individual's right to property that federal judges have tossed in the ash can. And if the American public knew what was going on, practically every federal judge in this country would be behind bars. When I say that, I mean it literally. I'm not saying it figuratively. Section 241 of the U.S. Criminal Code makes it a crime for two or more persons to conspire to deprive any American of any right or privilege secured to them by the laws of the United States, the Constitution. Now, if the payment of income tax were mandatory, it'd violate the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment.
I'm sorry,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
First speaker will be Irwin Schiff.
A former Chief Justice, John Marshall, said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And no greater example of this is what's happened to this country. Before the Second World War, before the income tax, which was really imposed in 1943 by way of withholding taxes, America had the highest standard of living in the world. America exported all manner of goods all over the world. The dollar was regarded as the world's strongest currency. America was the biggest creditor nation. Now we're the biggest debtor nation. There are at least 9 countries with standards of living higher than our own. There are at least 9 countries with wage scales higher than our own. It's clear the federal government is destroying this country by extorting income taxes from the American public, and the reason why no American is required to pay income taxes, you can pay it voluntarily. If you want to volunteer, go do so. But I and millions of others Americans are no longer volunteering. And the reason why, if the income tax were compulsory, it would violate the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and all 3 taxing clauses of the Constitution, as well as the 16th Amendment. Now, we have a country that's going crazy. The power to tax is the power to destroy. I believe if you cut the roots off, the tree dies. I'm not interested in tacking twigs, I'm tacking leaves. I want to prevent the government from extorting, and this is money from the American public, and this is the chief issue I think the Libertarian Party should bring to the American public so that the IRS and the courts will no longer be able to intimidate the American public into paying a tax that no law requires anybody to pay. And I think once the American public knows that, you'll see the federal bureaucracy, the bureaucrats will simply wither. The federal government is like a huge hemorrhoid, and we have to excise that hemorrhoid. You know, it's amazing. It's amazing the press. The press sees all of these little issues like unemployment, like youth, pregnancies of youth, homelessness, and they think all of these problems are separate. No. All of the problem stems from the government taking 50% of what the average American pays. When I was growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, women didn't work. They were home taking care of the kids. Now there is no American worker who can support his family just on his own paycheck. Because you know what? The average American worker in 1920 got twice as much money than the average American today. But I only got 3 minutes of my time. I'm supposed to comment on the other candidates. All I'm saying, I want to focus. Excuse me, John. I really want to focus on the criminal and destructive nature of the federal government, and I want to tell all Americans how they can immediately stop paying income taxes by claiming exempt on a W-4, and I can even show you how to get all the money back you were duped into paying this year by filing a zero income tax return, refusing to assess yourself, and ask for it all back. I want to thank you very much.
I must confess my surprise. Of all our candidates, I did not expect that Irwin Schiff would be the first one to come in under the allotted time. Final candidate to answer the first question is Irwin Schiff.
Well, what issue would I stress? I really haven't considered it. Let me take a moment. What I would stress is, number one, the fact that all Americans, I invite all Americans to join with me in not paying income taxes. You have a patriotic duty not to support the shysters, the spendthrifts, the drunken sailors in Washington who are simply dissipating our wealth. But the second thing I want to emphasize is the corruption and the criminality that exists on the federal bench. Many of you have heard, lawyers like to say, I'm sure you've heard this, that the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. And I always say, why? Is it written in Chinese? It doesn't have to be interpreted. Incidentally, if it had to be interpreted, then the Constitution would be void for vagueness. If the Constitution was what men in bat suits say it is, then we'd be a nation of men and not a nation of law. No, the Constitution means what it says, and I don't have to have a bunch of lawyers who've been elevated to the federal bench. Many people don't know this, but before any lawyer gets appointed to the federal bench, he must take a test on the Constitution, and only those who fail are allowed. You know, I would emphasize that the Constitution says the government can regulate interstate commerce. When the Founding Fathers, I'm sorry, thank you very much.
We're going to give the candidates 1 minute apiece to answer them, and if you want the slightest probability of your question being addressed, you will keep it short and germane. All right, for the second question, we're going to flip-flop again back to our original order, and question number 2 is, how will you bring your message to the American electorate? So speaking first on the second question is Irwin Schiff.
Well, I purchased a bunch of postal cards. Well, you know, I've done over 1,000 talk shows myself in the last 10 years. I have a book that's currently selling called The Federal Mafia, How It Illegally Imposes and Unlawfully Collects Income Taxes. We've sold over 400,000 books over the last 10 years, which is not too bad for a self-published author. And, you know, I have 2 radio talk shows in Las Vegas, and every Thursday I make it a habit. I call the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I say, I tell them they're live on KLAV, and I offer them $5,000 if they'll identify any law that says you got to pay income tax, and they hang up on me. I call them back. I do this every Thursday, so at least the people... communicate the way I have been communicating over the years. Hopefully, if I got the nomination, to make it a little easier. Of course, people keep saying, you know, he went to jail. Well, so did Gandhi, so did Solzhenitsyn. I went to jail because Peter Dorsey, who's now the chief judge in Connecticut, actually told my jury they could convict me of tax evasion. Even if the government didn't prove the act of evasion, I was charged with committing. And 3 other criminals on the Second Circuit Court of Appeal affirmed that jury instruction. And my conviction was written up in the Journal of Taxation, and even they said I was never convicted of tax evasion because I was never convicted of committing any act of tax evasion. So I would just keep doing what I have been doing. Hopefully, getting the nomination would make it that much easier, and I want to thank you very much for all your kind attention.
Twice in one day. Irwin Schiff.
Well, the thing is, how would my candidate help promote a more libertarian environment in this country? The reason for the party is to get a more libertarian environment, not to necessarily strengthen the party, because we're not interested in patronage. The Republicans and Democrats are involved in politics because of the patronage and the money they make through politics. The fact of the matter is, in the past 20 or 25 years, we've run libertarian candidates who've been very articulate, Andre Maru, and certainly Ron Paul. But we have a more libertarian environment now than we started 25 years ago. I submit we have a more authoritarian, a more dictatorial, as evidenced by the fact that we have civil seizures and forfeitures. Now, the only way we're going to get a more libertarian environment is reduce the power and the influence of the federal government, and the only way we can do that is cut off its source of funds. See, the American public